A windmill turned in darkness on the Texas South Plains. The sound was metal against metal. Wire hummed between fence posts that extended toward the horizon. At a line camp miles from anywhere, a single lantern burned. Someone was awake, watching cattle. The cattle belonged to people who would never ride this fence themselves. This isn't only a ranch story. It's an industrial story written on grass. The Spade Ranch grew to hundreds of thousands of acres. Men who owned none of it patrolled the land. They built fences, maintained windmills, moved herds according to instructions from distant owners. Eventually, the ranch was sold. Hundreds of families bought pieces of it. They turned the grazing land into farms and towns. But first, there was a question no one asked directly. Was this a ranch built from a frontier dream, or was it a market-making machine built to sell wire? Chapter 1. The Mark That Moved. A brand is supposed to mark cattle. The spade-shaped burn on a hip proves ownership when animals scatter. It has to be simple enough to read from horseback. It has to be distinctive enough that no one mistakes it. Fire heated the iron. The mark stayed. That was the purpose. Move the herd. Sell what you can. In Lamar County in northeastern Texas, someone gathered cattle marked with the Spade brand. The Panhandle offered what Lamar County could not: space without fences, grass that hadn't been grazed to stubble, water in creeks that ran most of the year. The herd moved west. The movement was slow. You can't rush cattle across that distance. The men who moved them set up camps where they could. Saddler Creek became one camp. Barton Creek became another. These weren't towns. They were places where a wagon stopped long enough to boil coffee before sunrise. Horses grazed, hobbled, while the herd rested. When the herd moved, the camp disappeared. The work had a rhythm. Mornings began cold, even in summer. Someone stoked a fire from overnight embers. Someone else checked the horses for injuries, loose shoes, anything that would slow the day. The foreman walked through camp with rope over his shoulder. He watched for the animal that would cause trouble. He watched for the rider who hadn't learned yet. A good foreman could read cattle and men the same way he read weather. A poor foreman learned by losing animals or losing crew. The early managers were men whose names appeared in records, but whose stories didn't. Baldy Oliver was one. Dave Nall was another. They ran cattle when that meant long days in the saddle and longer nights when weather turned. A trail camp morning started with whoever drew night guard finishing their shift. They were cold and stiff from hours circling bedded animals. They rode in as someone else rode out. Coffee got passed. Breakfast happened if there was time. Then the herd moved again, or it didn't, depending on grass and water and how far the next camp sat. The brand traveled with the herd. Every animal wore the spade mark. When ownership changed, the mark stayed. When animals sold, buyers knew what they were purchasing. The brand told them. It was simple. It was functional. It was supposed to end at the animal. The brand didn't end there. It started marking land instead. Somewhere in the shift from Lamar County to the Panhandle, the spade stopped being only a cattle mark. It became a name attached to acreage, to water rights, to decisions made in offices far from any camp. The mark that burned into cowhide started appearing on deeds, on maps, on documents filed with counties that barely had courthouses. A brand that was supposed to identify animals in motion began identifying ground that wasn't moving. The foreman still checked the mark. He still walked through camp at dawn. He still made decisions about which horses got ridden and which pastures got grazed. But someone else was making different decisions. Someone who never felt rope burn across their palm. Someone who saw the spade not as a tool for managing cattle, but as a tool for organizing land. Land that could be bought, expanded, fenced, controlled. The herd still moved, the camps still functioned, the work still required early mornings and long rides. Nothing about the daily rhythm changed for the men holding the rope or riding the line, but the meaning of the brand had shifted underneath them. A mark that identified property had become property itself. The brand moved from fire to paper. Chapter 2. 23 sections. They didn't build a ranch first. They built a math problem. A deed sat on a table somewhere. A pen scratched across paper. Section numbers, township numbers, range numbers. The language of the Texas land system translated grass into geometry. 23 sections. That was the beginning. August 25th, 1880. Donley County. Someone signed, someone filed. The brand that had marked cattle now marked squares on a map. A section is 640 acres. 23 sections is 14,720 acres. That was the start. Not a pasture you could see from one ridge. Not a holding that fit inside what a man on horseback could patrol in a day. A number on paper that required other numbers to make sense of it. The pen kept scratching. The purchase wasn't about better grass or closer water. Those mattered, but they weren't the point. The point was acquisition. Land was being measured, divided, recorded, and claimed faster than anyone could fence it. The panhandle was being carved into property before it stopped being open range. You didn't need cattle to buy land. You needed paper. You needed someone who understood section lines and county records. You needed capital or credit. Then you traced the boundaries you'd purchased and tried to make them real. Survey stakes appeared. Men drove them into the ground at section corners. The stakes marked points that existed on maps, but not yet in any physical way a cowboy would recognize. This line runs north. This line runs west. The intersection is a corner. Write it down. Move to the next one. The expansion happened fast. By 1887, the Spade holdings exceeded 300,000 acres. The land spread across 4 counties: Donley County, where it started, then Lamb County, Floyd County, Hale County. The numbers accumulated faster than the fences. 300,000 acres is 468 square miles. It's an area larger than some eastern states. It's distance that can't be crossed in a day or a week. It's not a ranch you run by knowing every draw and spring. It's a ranch you run by knowing what the paperwork says you own. The late 1880s tested what paper ownership meant. Drought arrived. Creeks that ran most years stopped running. Grass that should have grown didn't. Cattle that should have gained weight didn't. Then winter came hard. Blizzards swept across the plains with nothing to stop them. Snow buried what little grass remained. Cattle drifted with the wind and died against fences they couldn't see. The losses were heavy. Ranches that had expanded on paper discovered that paper didn't keep animals alive. Some operations collapsed entirely. Others survived by selling off land they'd just acquired, trying to raise cash to buy feed or restock herds. The Spade survived. The brand appeared in new county records. 1889, Mitchell County. That was the Renderbrook purchase, the second ranch that would become part of the system. 1891. More registrations. Hale County, Lubbock County. The brand kept spreading, but survival required more than filing papers. It required infrastructure. Fences to control grazing, windmills to reach underground water, pasture divisions to rotate herds, line camps to extend supervision across distances too large for anyone to ride from a central headquarters. Someone would have to build that infrastructure. Someone would have to pay for it. Someone would have to maintain it after it was built. The question was who? Who had the capital to turn paper sections into functioning range? Who had the technical knowledge to fence hundreds of thousands of acres? Who had the industrial connections to source enough wire, enough windmill parts, enough steel to make the geometry on the map become real? A ranch that size wasn't built by cowboys. It was built by people who understood how to move materials and money across long distances, people who saw land as something to be engineered, not just grazed. Then the wire men arrive. Chapter 3. Wire and Sales. The partnership wasn't ranchers and cowboys, it was ranchers and salesmen. Barbed wire had been patented in the 1870s. By the 1880s, it was being manufactured at industrial scale. The problem wasn't production. The problem was convincing people to buy it. Open-range operators resisted fencing. They had built their operations on the assumption that cattle could graze wherever grass grew. Fencing meant dividing land. It meant investing capital in something that couldn't move with the herd. It meant accepting that the open-range era was ending. The wire companies needed salesmen who understood ranching, men who could speak the language of livestock and grass, men who could explain why fencing made economic sense, even when it contradicted everything ranchers had built their lives around. Judson P. Warner was one of those men. Warner worked as a barbed wire agent. His job was to sell wire and to supervise the fencing once ranchers agreed to buy. He didn't just take orders, he advised on fence placement. He calculated how much wire a ranch would need. He arranged delivery. He sometimes stayed to oversee the work. The wire arrived in coils. Heavy coils wound tight. Someone unrolled them along the line where the fence would go. The wire caught light as it unspooled. The barbs were sharp. They were designed that way. Cattle would test a fence once, maybe twice. The barbs taught them not to test again. Posts had to be set first. Wooden posts for the corners and gates, metal posts for the long runs between. The posts were driven into the ground with sledgehammers or mechanical drivers. The work was hard. The ground was often hard, too. Then the wire was stretched. This required leverage. A team of men or horses pulled the wire tight between posts. Too loose and cattle could push through. Too tight and the wire would snap in winter cold or summer heat. Getting the tension right required experience. Staples hammered into wooden posts held the wire in place. The staples had to be driven at the right angle. Driven wrong, they'd pull loose under tension. Driven too deep, they'd cut the wire. A man hammering staples all day developed blistered hands even through gloves. The work created wounds. Wire cut skin easily. Barbs tore cloth and flesh. A careless moment meant blood. Hands that built fence bore scars. Those scars lasted longer than the fence did. Warner's role went beyond selling a product. He was selling a system. Fencing changed how ranches operated. It meant pasture rotation. It meant controlled breeding. It meant knowing exactly which animals were where. It meant infrastructure that required maintenance. A fence wasn't built once and forgotten. Wire sagged, posts rotted, staples worked loose. Animals testing the fence found weak points. Weather stressed every connection. A fence required constant attention or it failed. But a working fence meant control. Control meant efficiency. Efficiency meant profit. That was the argument Warner and men like him made to every rancher who still believed open range was possible. The Spade bought wire, not a small order for a few miles of perimeter. They bought wire in quantities that suggested they understood what was coming. The open range was ending. The future belonged to operations that could divide land, manage herds scientifically, and scale up behind steel barriers. Warner supervised the fencing. He didn't build it himself. He oversaw the crews. He checked the work. He made sure the wire went where it needed to go. His presence means the fence was being built to serve a larger purpose than just keeping cattle contained. The wire companies were creating their own market. Every mile of fence meant more wire sold. Every rancher who fenced created pressure on neighboring ranchers to fence, too. Once fencing started, it spread. But selling wire was one thing. Buying the land that needed the wire was something else entirely. That required different capital, different vision, different connections. An industrialist buys land that will need wire. Chapter 4. Elwood arrives. He didn't ride in with a rope. He arrived with leverage. Isaac L. Ellwood was a barbed wire manufacturer. He owned factories in DeKalb, Illinois. His company produced thousands of miles of wire every year. The wire went to farms, ranches, railroads, anywhere people needed to divide land. Elwood didn't manufacture wire because he loved ranching. He manufactured wire because fencing created demand. Every acre fenced was wire sold. Every ranch that adopted fencing pushed neighboring ranches to do the same. The business model was simple: make the product, create the market, control the supply. By the late 1880s, Elwood had capital that most ranchers couldn't imagine. He also had something more valuable than capital. He had wire, coils of it, warehouses full of it, wire that could be traded like currency in a region that desperately needed it. When Elwood entered the Texas Panhandle, he didn't come looking for grass. He came looking for land that would need his product. The Spade Ranch was already established. The brand was registered. The land base was expanding. But expansion required fencing. Fencing required wire. Wire required payment. Elwood made an offer. He would supply the wire. In exchange, he wanted ownership. The transaction wasn't simple cash for land. It was more complicated than that. It was wire for cattle. It was manufacturing capacity traded for grazing rights. It was industrial capital exchanged for agricultural assets. The details show how the deal worked. Elwood purchased approximately 800 head of cattle that carried the Spade brand. That was the beginning. Those cattle weren't the point. The land was the point. The North Pasture measured 128,000 acres. That was the scale Elwood was operating at. Not a few thousand acres that a cowboy might save up to buy. Not a family ranch passed down through generations. 128,000 acres acquired through a transaction that involved manufactured goods more than it involved money. A ledger somewhere recorded the exchange. Wire coils counted, cattle counted, acreage measured. The ledger didn't care about grass quality or water sources. It cared about quantities that could be recorded and verified. Letters traveled between Texas and Illinois. Instructions, confirmations, decisions made in an office far from any fence line. Elwood managed the Spade the way he managed his factories, through correspondence, through managers he trusted to execute plans, through systems that could operate without his physical presence. The expansion continued. 1889. The Spade brand was registered in Mitchell County. That was the Rendabrook Ranch. Another acquisition, another piece of the system Elwood was building. 1891. More brand registrations. Hale County, Lubbock County. The Spade mark spreading across county records. Each registration represented land claimed. Each represented future fencing. Each represented wire to be stretched. This was vertical integration. Elwood owned the wire factory. He owned the ranches that needed wire. He controlled both ends of the transaction. When the Spade bought wire, the money flowed back to Elwood's company. When the ranch expanded, it needed more wire. The system fed itself. But the transaction that revealed the strategy most clearly was how Elwood acquired cattle for Renderbrook. He paid in wire. The wire went to other ranchers. Those ranchers used it to fence their land. The cattle came to Elwood's ranches. The wire stayed on other people's property. Everyone who bought that wire became dependent on Elwood's supply chain. Everyone who fenced with it became part of the market he'd created. This wasn't ranching. This was market-making disguised as ranching. Wire treated as currency only worked if both parties agreed on its value. The Texas Panhandle in the early 1890s agreed. Wire was valuable. Wire was necessary. Wire was worth trading cattle for. Elwood understood this before most ranchers did. His competitors manufactured wire and waited for customers. Elwood manufactured wire and created the circumstances that made customers necessary. He bought the land. The land needed fencing. The fencing needed his wire. The profits came from both ends. The strategy worked because the open range was already dying. Ranchers who resisted fencing found themselves surrounded by operations that had fenced. Their cattle drifted onto fenced land and couldn't drift back. Their water sources got claimed by neighbors with legal boundaries. The choice became fence or fail. Elwood didn't cause that pressure, but he capitalized on it better than anyone else. He saw barbed wire not just as a product, but as a tool for restructuring how land was owned and operated. Every fence line he built on his own ranches was an advertisement for what other ranches needed to do. The industrial logic was ruthless. You don't buy a ranch to raise cattle. You buy a ranch to demonstrate demand for the product you already make. You don't fence to contain animals. You fence to create a market for fencing. You don't expand across counties because you love Texas grass. You expand because scale proves the model works and forces everyone else to adopt it. But there was a problem Elwood couldn't solve from Illinois. Wire doesn't stretch itself. Fences don't maintain themselves. Windmills don't fix themselves when they break. Cattle don't move themselves between pastures. Someone had to do the physical work. Someone had to live on that land. Someone had to make the daily decisions that kept the system functioning. A line requires patrol. Chapter 5. 2 ranches. 1 landscape breeds. Another landscape turns animals into money. Renderbrook sat in Mitchell County. The land was different there. Breaks country. Water ran in creeks that carved through rough terrain. Springs emerged from rocky draws. Brush provided cover. The landscape offered what cattle needed for calving and what young stock needed to survive their first years. The South Plains Spade was different. Flat grassland, wind without obstacles. Water only where windmills pulled it from underground. No natural shelter. The openness that made fencing practical also made survival harder for young animals. Elwood owned both. The same brand marked cattle in both places. But the ranches served different functions. Renderbrook was where calves were born, where cows raised them, where young cattle gained strength before facing harsher conditions. The landscape supported breeding in ways the South Plains couldn't match. Water availability meant cows could nurse calves without stress. Cover meant survival rates improved. The Breaks country did the work that flat grassland couldn't do. The South Plains Spade was where cattle finished, where young stock became market-ready steers, where the grass fattened animals for sale. The landscape was engineered for efficiency. Fenced pastures controlled grazing. Windmills provided water on schedule. Every acre was measured and managed. The system worked because both ranches existed. One produced, one processed. One landscape did what came naturally. The other landscape did what infrastructure made possible. Cattle moved between them. Calves born at Renderbrook traveled to the South Plains when they were old enough. They crossed from one ranch to the other. They crossed from one county to another. They crossed from one landscape to another. But they never crossed out of Elwood's control. The moment a calf left Renderbrook, it entered a different kind of operation. The South Plains divided animals into pastures by age and condition. Steers grazed in rotations designed to maximize weight gain. Every movement was calculated. Every season had a purpose. The grass-fed cattle that would eventually generate revenue thousands of miles away in markets Renderbrook would never see. A herd crossing the boundary between ranches crossed more than geography. It crossed from breeding ground to finishing ground, from natural landscape to engineered landscape, from one part of the supply chain to another. This was vertical integration applied to cattle. Control breeding, control finishing, control every step between birth and sale. The brand on the animal meant it belonged to the same owner, whether it stood in Brake's country or on the plains. The system eliminated middlemen. It eliminated the need to buy young stock from outside sources. It eliminated uncertainty about animal quality. Other ranchers bought their calves. Elwood produced his. Other ranchers hoped the animals they purchased would perform well. Elwood knew the bloodlines because he controlled them. Other ranchers faced market fluctuations when buying young stock. Elwood's only cost was the grass and labor at Renderbrook. The supply chain was internal, closed, self-sufficient. Renderbrook provided what the South Plains needed. The South Plains sold what Renderbrook produced. The profit came from both ends. The risk was distributed across both landscapes. But the system required coordination. Someone had to decide when cattle moved. Someone had to organize the drive between ranches. Someone had to maintain records of which animals went where. Someone had to ensure both ranches functioned as parts of a single operation rather than as separate enterprises. The paperwork linked them as much as the brand did. Cattle counts at Renderbrook had to match cattle arrivals at the South Plains. Ages had to be tracked. Breeding records had to be maintained. Shipping schedules had to be planned months in advance. The system only worked if information flowed as reliably as cattle did. Elwood built this from Illinois. He never lived on either ranch. He visited occasionally. He made decisions through correspondence and through managers he trusted to execute plans. The distance between the owner and the operation was vast, but the system functioned because it was designed to function without constant oversight. The two-ranch model proved something important. A ranch didn't have to be one place. It could be multiple places, serving coordinated purposes. Land didn't have to do everything. It could specialize. One landscape for breeding, another for finishing, infrastructure where it made sense, natural advantages where they existed. This was industrial thinking applied to grass and cattle. Break the process into stages. Optimize each stage. Connect them with logistics. Extract maximum efficiency from every component. The South Plains Spade and Renderbrook weren't competing ranches that happened to share an owner. They were integrated pieces of a production system. Cattle were the raw material. Grass was the processing medium. The market was the destination. Everything in between was engineering. The ranch becomes a machine. Chapter 6. 54 miles. It wasn't a ranch. It was a corridor you had to patrol. The South Plains Spade didn't spread in all directions like most ranches. It extended in one direction, north to south. A narrow strip of fenced grassland that ran for miles without varying much in width. By 1902, the ranch covered approximately 262,000 acres. That sounds like a massive holding. It was, but the shape mattered more than the size. The ranch was about 8 to 10 miles wide and approximately 54 miles long. Those dimensions created a specific kind of problem. You couldn't see across the ranch, but you could ride its length. If you started at dawn and pushed hard, you might reach the far end by dark. A rider left camp in the morning. The fence line extended ahead and behind. There was no end visible in either direction. The fence was the landmark, the reference point, what you followed. The next windmill became the destination. You rode toward it, checked the water, the pump, and the pasture. Then you looked for the next windmill. It was always there, about 4 miles away. The distance was calculated, engineered, designed so cattle could reach water without traveling too far. The windmill marked progress, location, and the divisions between one pasture and the next. When you couldn't see the windmill yet, you rode until you could. When you reached it, you kept riding. This wasn't open range. This was managed range organized into a linear system. The corridor existed because the fencing existed, and the fencing existed because someone had calculated how to divide 262,000 acres into units that could be supervised. The headquarters sat somewhere in the middle of that corridor, a fixed point where decisions were made and supplies stored. But the work happened miles away, at line camps, small outposts along the corridor where riders stayed for days or weeks. A line camp was minimal: shelter, a place to sleep, a place to cook, maybe a corral for horses. Nothing permanent enough to be called comfortable, everything temporary enough to be abandoned if the fence line shifted or the camp was no longer needed. The rider at a line camp worked alone most of the time, or with one other person. The isolation wasn't accidental. It was efficiency. You didn't need a crew of 10 men to patrol a section of fence, just 1 or 2 who understood that the fence mattered more than anything else. Checking the fence was the job, every day, every section. Walk it or ride it, look for breaks, sags, or places where cattle had tested it and found weakness. Fix what needed fixing and report what couldn't be fixed immediately. The fence defined the corridor, contained the cattle, separated one pasture from the next, kept neighboring herds out, and the Spade herds in. Without the fence, the corridor concept didn't work. The ranch would be just grass that animals could wander across. Maintaining 54 miles of perimeter fence, plus all the interior cross fences, required constant attention. Wire stretched in heat, contracted in cold, and broke under stress. Posts rotted, staples pulled loose, animals pushed, and weather tested every connection. A rider checking the fence carried tools: wire cutters, staples, a hammer, pliers, splice materials. The tools weren't optional. They were required because finding a problem meant fixing it immediately. You didn't ride back to camp to report a break. You fixed it and continued the patrol. The corridor shape meant supervision was always linear. You couldn't see the whole ranch from any high point because there was no high point, and because even if there was, the ranch was too long to see end to end. You rode the line. You knew your section. You relied on whoever had the next section to know theirs. Communication between sections was slow. You saw other riders occasionally. You passed messages when you did. You heard about problems that happened miles away, days after they happened. The corridor connected everything geographically, but isolated everyone operationally. This created a specific kind of management challenge. How do you supervise an operation where the workers are scattered across 54 miles and where checking on them means riding for hours? How do you maintain standards when each section operates almost independently? The answer was systematic routine. Every task had a procedure. Every procedure had a schedule. Every schedule was enforced through the only mechanism that worked across distance: reputation. The foreman's reputation, the ranch's reputation, the understanding that sloppy work would be discovered eventually and that consequences followed discovery. The corridor wasn't designed for beauty, it was designed for efficiency. Take a long strip of land, fence it, divide it into pastures, space windmills evenly, position line camps at intervals, assign riders to sections. Let the system run. The system ran. Cattle moved between pastures on schedule. Grass got grazed in rotation. Water got pumped. Fences got maintained. The corridor functioned because every component did what it was supposed to do when it was supposed to do it. But the corridor had a weakness. It depended entirely on the boundaries holding. One major fence break could empty a pasture. One failed windmill could make a section unusable. One neglected line camp could create a gap in supervision that spread problems for miles. The corridor was efficient when everything worked. It was vulnerable when anything failed. Fences must hold. Chapter 7. Infrastructure Debt. The ranch solved water, then it chained itself to upkeep. The South Plains had underground water. Getting it to the surface required windmills, lots of them. The windmills were spaced approximately every 4 miles across the ranch. That spacing wasn't arbitrary, it was calculated. Cattle needed to reach water without walking too far. 4 miles was the compromise between coverage and cost. Each windmill was a machine. Machines break. A windmill repair started with climbing. Someone climbed the tower. The tower was tall enough to catch wind, tall enough to be dangerous. The climb happened in wind because wind was why windmills existed. The tower swayed. The metal was cold in winter and hot in summer. You climbed anyway. The pump mechanism sat at the top. Gears, bearings, a rod that connected the wheel to the pump below. The rod traveled down through the tower into the ground, into the well. The rod had to move smoothly. When it didn't, the water stopped. Grease kept things moving. The grease had to be applied regularly, not when something broke, before something broke. Someone climbed the tower with grease, applied it to the moving parts, climbed back down, rode to the next windmill, repeated the process. A broken rod was a different problem. The rod snapped under stress. Metal fatigue, constant motion wearing material down until it failed. When the rod broke, the windmill kept turning, but the water stopped pumping. The cattle didn't care why the water stopped. They just needed water. Fixing a broken rod meant pulling the entire assembly, disconnecting the pump mechanism, pulling the broken rod up from the well, installing a new rod, reconnecting everything, testing it. The repair took hours. Sometimes it took days if parts weren't available. The fence required even more attention. The perimeter fence was 6 wires high. The cross fences that divided the interior into pastures were 5 wires high. That was the standard, 6 for the boundary, 5 for the divisions. The math added up fast. 54 miles of perimeter meant miles of 6-wire fence. The interior cross fences added more miles. Every pasture needed boundaries. Pastures averaged 40 sections each. A section was 640 acres. 40 sections was 25,600 acres per pasture. Multiple pastures meant multiple fence lines. A fence splice in wind was miserable work. The wind on the South Plains never stopped. It just varied in intensity. Splicing wire meant working with metal that moved. That cut. That didn't cooperate. You found the break. You cut the damaged section out. You spliced new wire in. You stretched it tight. You secured it to the posts. The wire had to match the tension of the existing fence. Too loose and cattle would push through. Too tight and the next temperature change would snap it. The wind made everything harder. Wire whipped. Tools slipped. Hands went numb. You finished the splice. You tested it by pulling hard. If it held, you moved on. If it didn't, you started over. Infrastructure that made the corridor work required constant maintenance. The windmills needed grease every few weeks. They needed inspection after every storm. They needed parts replaced on schedules that depended on use and weather and luck. The fences needed daily patrol, weekly repairs, seasonal reinforcement. Wire didn't maintain itself. Posts didn't stay straight. Staples didn't hold forever. The system worked. But working required labor. Skilled labor. Labor that understood mechanical systems. Labor that could work alone for days. Labor that could solve problems with limited tools and no backup. Every 4 miles of ranch needed a windmill. Every windmill needed maintenance. Every pasture needed fence. Every fence needed patrol. The numbers multiplied into a maintenance burden that never ended. The ranch didn't employ people to ride horses and look at scenery. It employed people to keep infrastructure functional, to keep water pumping, to keep fences standing, to keep the system operating at the level of efficiency that justified its existence. The cost of the system wasn't just the initial installation, it was the ongoing upkeep. It was the wages paid to people who climbed windmill towers in wind and spliced fence wire in storms. It was the replacement parts. It was the constant attention required to prevent small problems from becoming catastrophic failures. A single failed windmill meant a pasture without reliable water. A single major fence break meant cattle mixing between pastures. Mixing meant losing track of which animals were where. Losing track meant losing control. Losing control meant losing the entire purpose of the system. So the maintenance happened. Every day, every season, year after year. The infrastructure demanded it. The system required it. The investment couldn't be abandoned. The South Plains Spade had solved the water problem. It had solved the boundary problem. It had solved the pasture division problem. But solving those problems had created a new problem: dependency. The ranch depended on infrastructure that depended on constant human intervention. You couldn't leave a windmill broken. You couldn't ignore a fence break. You couldn't defer maintenance until it was convenient. The system worked because people made it work, every day, in all weather. Without exception, the infrastructure had transformed the ranch from a cattle operation into something else, something that required mechanics as much as it required cowboys, something that chained itself to upkeep the moment it chose engineering over adaptation. Someone has to pay. Chapter 8. The Foreman. The owner is far away. The foreman is the law. Isaac Ellwood was in Illinois. The ranch was in Texas. Capital in one place, labor in another. Office decisions and horseback decisions, ownership and operation. J. Frank Norfleet was the foreman. He didn't own the land. He didn't own the cattle. He didn't own the fences or the windmills or the headquarters buildings, but he controlled all of it. Norfleet made the daily decisions. Which pastures got grazed, which cattle got moved, which repairs got priority, which men got assigned to which tasks. The decisions weren't his to make legally, but they were his to make practically. When supplies ran low, someone had to go to town. Norfleet didn't go. He sent someone else. Then he went back to riding the line. The fence needed checking, the windmills needed inspection, the cattle needed supervision. Someone else could handle town. Norfleet stayed on the ranch. The pattern repeated. Supplies needed. Someone sent to town. Norfleet rode the line. The isolation wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. Town meant time away from the ranch, time away from supervision, time when things could go wrong without anyone noticing. Norfleet built the headquarters. He chose the location. He decided what structures were needed. He supervised construction. The headquarters became the fixed point in the corridor, the place where decisions got made, the place Norfleet controlled. The isolation extended to how the ranch operated. Norfleet didn't rely on outside help. He didn't bring in consultants. He didn't seek advice from neighboring ranches. He ran the Spade according to systems he developed, systems that worked because he enforced them. The foreman's authority came from distance. Elwood was too far away to make daily decisions. Letters took time. Telegraph messages were expensive. Visits were rare. Someone had to run the ranch between instructions from Illinois. That someone was Norfleet. He made hiring decisions. He made firing decisions. He decided who got promoted to positions of responsibility and who stayed doing basic labor. The men working the ranch answered to Norfleet, not to Elwood. Elwood was a name on paper. Norfleet was the man they saw every day. His wife Eliza became part of the ranch's infrastructure. She nursed sick cowboys when they couldn't work. She treated injuries that happened far from any doctor, a hand crushed between posts, a rope burn that got infected, a fever that came on suddenly. She handled what needed handling. The work was unofficial, unpaid as far as records showed, but necessary. A sick cowboy at a line camp couldn't get to town. A man injured during a repair couldn't wait for help to arrive. Someone had to provide care. Eliza did. She worked quietly. No fanfare, no recognition in ranch records, just the practical reality that keeping men functional kept the ranch functional. An injured hand got bandaged. A fevered man got tended. The work continued. Norfleet's isolation reputation grew. He avoided town. He avoided social obligations. He avoided anything that took him away from the ranch. Other ranchers noticed. People talked. The Spade foreman never came to gatherings, never participated in the social networks that connected panhandle operations. The isolation served a purpose. It kept focus on the ranch. It prevented distractions. It established that the Spade operated according to its own rules. Norfleet wasn't interested in how other ranches did things. He was interested in how the Spade did things. This created a specific kind of power, the foreman who never left the ranch, who never delegated supervision to others, who controlled every detail through constant presence. The power came from knowing more about the operation than anyone else, from being there when decisions needed making, from being the constant while everything else changed. Elwood sent instructions. Norfleet implemented them or didn't. The distance meant verification was difficult. If Norfleet said something couldn't be done, who would contradict him? If he said a different approach was necessary, who had better information? The foreman's word became fact because challenging it required presence Elwood didn't have. The system worked because Norfleet made it work. He understood the infrastructure. He knew which windmills were reliable and which needed constant attention. He knew which sections of fence were solid and which needed reinforcement. He knew which men could be trusted alone and which needed supervision. He knew the cattle, which bloodlines were productive, which animals to cull, and when to move herds between pastures. The knowledge came from daily observation, from riding the line, from being present. The ranch produced cattle efficiently, in quantities that justified the investment. The fences held, the windmills pumped, the pastures rotated on schedule. The system, Norfleet built and maintained, functioned. The output was measurable. Cattle shipped to market, revenue generated, profit returned to Elwood in Illinois. The numbers proved the system worked, but they didn't show who made the system work, the daily decisions. the constant supervision, the refusal to leave the ranch unattended. Norfleet never owned the Spade, but he ran it. He built its operational structure, enforced its standards, and created the culture that made the system function. The power was real, even though the ownership wasn't. The machine works. Chapter 9. 30,000 head. Rendebrook made cattle. The South Plains made profits. The two-ranch system functioned because both ranches maintained scale. Rendebrook carried approximately 15,000 head. The South Plains Spade carried approximately 15,000 head. The numbers weren't identical year to year, but the balance was deliberate. Rendebrook produced calves. The calves stayed there until they were old enough to move. Then they traveled to the South Plains. The South Plains grazed them until they were ready to sell. Then they shipped to market. The sorting happened at both ends. At Rendebrook, someone decided which animals moved and which stayed. Young steers went to the South Plains. Breeding stock stayed. Culls got separated. The decisions required judgment. Someone walked through the herd making choices. At the South Plains, the animals that arrived from Rendebrook got sorted again, by age, by condition, by which pasture they'd graze. The sorting determined everything that happened next: which grass they ate, how long they stayed, when they shipped. The loading ramp was where theory became practice. Cattle moved up the ramp into whatever transport was available. Before the railroad reached the ranch, that meant trail drives. The ramp still mattered. It concentrated animals. It created a checkpoint. Someone counted as cattle moved up the ramp. When rail cars became available, the ramp served the same function differently. Cattle moved up. The rail car door opened. Animals pushed through. The door clanged shut. The count had to be exact. The buyer expected a specific number. The railroad charged by the head. Mistakes cost money. The counting happened with pencil and paper. Someone stood at the ramp with a tally sheet. Each animal that passed got marked. The marks accumulated into numbers. The numbers went into records. The records determined payment. This was logistics, as much as it was ranching. Getting animals from birth to sale required coordination across two ranches, multiple pastures, seasonal timing, and transportation infrastructure. Every step had to happen in sequence. Every sequence had to be documented. The shipping numbers revealed the system's capacity. Before 1908, the ranches shipped approximately 3,000 to 5,000 four-year-old steers annually. That was the steady output. Not the maximum capacity, not the emergency sell-off. The sustainable rate the system could maintain year after year. Four-year-old steers represented 4 years of investment, 4 years of grass, 4 years of water pumped by windmills, 4 years of fence maintenance, 4 years of labor. The animal walking up the loading ramp carried all those costs. The profit came from the difference between cost and sale price. The cost was mostly land, infrastructure, and labor. The sale price was whatever the market paid for finished cattle. The gap between them had to be large enough to justify the entire operation. Rendebrook's contribution was biological. Cows bred, calves born, young stock survived. The landscape supported the breeding cycle. The work was seasonal. Calving season, weaning season, selection season. The South Plains contribution was mechanical. Grass converted to weight. Weight converted to market value. The landscape was engineered for this conversion. Fenced pastures controlled grazing. Windmills provided water on schedule. The work was constant. Fence patrol, windmill maintenance, pasture rotation. The supply chain connected them. Cattle flowed from Rendebrook to the South Plains. Information flowed back. How many animals arrived? what condition they were in, how quickly they were gaining weight, whether more were needed or fewer. The system eliminated external dependencies. Elwood didn't buy young stock from other ranchers. He produced them at Renderbrook. He didn't rely on outside grass. He controlled the finishing pastures on the South Plains. He didn't depend on other people's infrastructure. He owned the fences and windmills. The integration meant control. Control meant predictability. Predictability meant the system could be planned years in advance. This many calves born this year meant this many steers shipping 4 years later. The math was reliable if the system functioned, but the system required transportation. Animals born at Renderbrook had to reach the South Plains. Animals finished on the South Plains had to reach markets. The distances were measured in days of travel, sometimes weeks. A rail car could move cattle in hours that would take weeks to drive. A rail car eliminated weight loss from the trail. A rail car reduced labor costs. A rail car meant cattle arrived at market in better condition. But rail cars required railroads. Railroads required investment that ranchers couldn't make alone. Railroads required traffic that justified laying track. Railroads followed their own logic. They served regions that generated revenue. They ignored regions that didn't. The shipping numbers proved the Spade generated revenue. 3,000 to 5,000 head annually was serious volume. Volume that railroad companies noticed. Volume that justified considering where to lay track next. The ranches were producing cattle at industrial scale, but they were shipping them using pre-industrial methods. Every sale was a walk. Chapter 10, 19. 12. Steel reached the grass. It turned pasture into property. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway was building west across the South Plains. The company made decisions based on tonnage and revenue potential. The Spade Ranch represented both: cattle to ship, land that could be sold, a customer that would generate traffic in both directions. In 1912, the line reached Littlefield. The track cut through the ranch corridor. Steel rails where grass had been. Telegraph poles followed the right-of-way. Stations appeared where only fence posts had stood. The whistle changed everything. The sound carried across distances that took days to ride. The whistle announced arrival, departure, and that time now moved on a schedule not determined by weather, cattle, or distance. The cattle cars sat on sidings. Empty cars waited to be filled. The cars were wooden, with slatted floors to let waste drop through, solid walls to contain animals yet ventilated enough to let air through. Each car could hold about 30 head, depending on size. Loading cattle into rail cars was different from loading them for a trail drive. A trail drive started slow and covered distance gradually. Cattle settled into the rhythm. A rail car was immediate. Animals pushed up the loading ramp, through the door into an enclosed space. The door closed. The train moved. The cattle cars filled quickly when a shipment was ready. One car, then another, then another. The counting happened at the ramp as before, but the destination was different. The animals would be in Kansas City or Chicago in days instead of weeks. They would arrive heavier, in better condition, ready to sell immediately. The railroad didn't just move cattle, it moved value. Cattle that used to lose weight on trail drives now maintained weight. Weight was money. The railroad preserved the money that trail drives consumed, but the railroad also did something else. It made land valuable in new ways. Survey stakes appeared along the right-of-way, railroad survey stakes, then town survey stakes. The railroad company owned land along its tracks, land it could sell, land that would generate development and more railroad traffic. The towns appeared fast: Anton, Ropesville, Wolforth, Smyre. The names went on plat maps that showed town lots, streets, a future that existed on paper before it existed on the ground. The town plats were hammered into boards with public notices. Come buy land, build a business, start a farm. The railroad will bring supplies in, ship your crops out. The infrastructure is here. The opportunity is here. The towns grew where the railroad decided they should grow, not where water was best or grass was richest. Where the railroad put a station, the station determined location, location determined value, value determined what happened next. The ranch land that the railroad cut through became something different. It was no longer just grazing land. It was land adjacent to transportation, with subdivision potential, suddenly worth more because steel ran through it. The spade had been valuable as a cattle operation. It became more valuable as land that could be converted to other uses. The railroad made the conversion possible, profitable, inevitable. Ranching required large, contiguous acreage. Farming required smaller parcels. Towns required even smaller parcels. The railroad enabled the shift from one to another. The steel made division practical, logical, the obvious next step. The railroad companies understood this. They weren't just in the transportation business, they were in the land development business. Every mile of track increased the value of land along that track. Every station created a node where development would cluster. Every town that grew generated more shipping traffic. The spade sat in the middle of this transformation. The ranch had been designed as a corridor. The railroad turned the corridor into something else, a logistics network, a development zone, a resource that could be liquidated piece by piece if the economics justified it. The foreman still rode the fence lines. The windmills still pumped water. The cattle still grazed in rotation. But the railroad changed what the land meant. It changed what the land could become. It changed the calculation of whether to keep ranching or to cash out. Elwood had built the ranch using industrial logic. The railroad extended that logic. If land could be engineered for cattle production, it could be re-engineered for other production. If grass could generate revenue as pasture, it could generate more revenue as farms and towns. The steel rails didn't just connect places, they created choices. Keep operating as a ranch, sell to the railroad, sell to farmers, subdivide for towns. The choices hadn't existed before 1912. After 1912, they were obvious. The trains ran on schedules, eastbound in the morning, westbound in the afternoon. The schedules were printed, posted, reliable. Time became something that could be planned around rather than something you adapted to. The ranch had operated according to seasons, calving season, shipping season, maintenance season. The railroad operated according to timetables. The two systems existed alongside each other, but only one could determine what happened to the land long term. Systems create dynasties. Chapter 11. The Notebook. A ranch can be inherited. A rule book can be inherited too. J. Frank Norfleet ran the Spade for years, then he left. The reason doesn't matter as much as what happened next. The ranch didn't collapse. The systems didn't fail. Someone else stepped into the role. D.N. Arnett became foreman. He was called Uncle Dick. The nickname suggested familiarity, but the work suggested something else. Arnett inherited more than a job title. He inherited a way of running things. The notebook sat on a table at headquarters. The notebook contained information: which pastures had been grazed, which windmills needed attention, which sections of fence were weak. The notebook was a record, but it was also a guide. It told you what had worked, what hadn't, what needed doing next. Arnett kept his own notebook. He added to it. He refined it. He passed knowledge forward the same way Norfleet had passed it to him. The notebook was institutional memory in physical form. The night guard rotation was written down, not memorized, not left to chance. Written, who rode which shift, how long each shift lasted, where each rider patrolled. The rotation ensured coverage. It ensured no section went unwatched. It ensured tired men got replaced by fresh men. Arnett enforced the rotation, not by yelling, by assignments. You rode night guard when the schedule said you rode night guard. You rode the section you were assigned. You stayed until your replacement arrived. The system worked because it was followed. Discipline happened through assignments, too. A man who shirked work didn't get fired immediately. He got assigned the worst jobs, the coldest patrols, the most isolated line camps. The assignments sent a message. Meet standards or life gets harder. Supply decisions followed patterns. Arnett knew which suppliers were reliable, which delivered on time, which tried to charge extra when weather made delivery difficult. The decisions weren't made fresh each time. They followed precedent. This supplier for wire, that supplier for windmill parts, another for feed when grass was short. The patterns created efficiency. They also created power. The foreman who knew the patterns controlled the ranch. The foreman who had the notebook had institutional memory. The foreman who enforced the rotation maintained order. Arnett wasn't inventing a system. He was maintaining one. The system had been built before he arrived. His job was to keep it running, to refine it where necessary, to pass it forward when his time ended. This was how dynasties worked, not through blood, through knowledge, through documented procedures, through systems that outlived the men who created them. Norfleet had built the operational structure. Arnett inherited it and improved it. Whoever came after Arnett would inherit what Arnett built. The ranch operated according to accumulated wisdom, not according to whoever happened to be foreman at the moment. The foreman was powerful, but the system was more powerful. The system determined how work got done, how men got supervised, how decisions got made. The foreman operated within the system, even when he refined it. This created stability. A ranch that depended entirely on one man's judgment would fail when that man left. A ranch that operated according to documented systems could survive transitions. The Spade survived transitions, but the stability had a cost. Innovation was slow. Change was resisted. The way things had always been done was the way things continued to be done, unless circumstances forced change. The railroad had forced change. The fencing had forced change. The windmills had forced change. But the daily operations? Those followed patterns that went back to Norfleet, back to the early days when someone first figured out how to manage a corridor ranch. Arnett's role was to preserve those patterns, to maintain standards, to ensure the next foreman could step in and continue without disruption. The ranch wasn't Arnett's, but the systems were his responsibility. The notebook got thicker, more pages, more information, more accumulated knowledge about what worked on this specific piece of ground with these specific challenges. The notebook was valuable, more valuable than any single cow, more valuable than most equipment. The notebook represented decades of trial and error. It represented knowledge that couldn't be recreated quickly. It represented the competitive advantage of having done something for a long time and learning from every mistake. When new foremen arrived, they read the notebook. They learned the rotation. They understood the supply decisions. They stepped into a role that came with instructions. The instructions weren't complete. but they were comprehensive enough that competent men could manage without constant oversight from Illinois. That was the point. Elwood couldn't manage the ranch daily from Illinois. He needed foremen who could operate independently, but he also needed consistency. The notebook provided consistency. The systems provided consistency. The dynasty of foremen provided consistency. The ranch became an institution, not just a business, an institution with traditions, procedures, and a culture that persisted across personnel changes. The Spade way of doing things, the way the night guard got assigned, the way supplies got ordered, the way discipline got enforced. Arnett became part of that institution. He wasn't building something new, he was stewarding something inherited. He would pass it forward, and someone else would steward it after him. The cycle continued. The founder dies. The ranch becomes an asset. Chapter 12. The storm. The myth says cowboys. The ledger says hours. The Spade Ranch operated on labor. Human labor. Daily labor. Labor that couldn't be automated or eliminated. Someone had to ride fence. Someone had to fix windmills. Someone had to move cattle. The system required people. The people required payment. Typical cowboy wages in the region during the early years ranged from about $25 to $35 per month. The pay included meals and a place to sleep, usually a bunkhouse, sometimes a line camp. The wage was standard across the panhandle. Not generous, not exploitative, standard. The monthly wage represented daily work, every day, not just when weather was good, not just when work was convenient. Every day the ranch operated, someone was working. The hours accumulated into months. The months accumulated into years. The cost accumulated into overhead that had to be justified by revenue. The labor wasn't just cowboys. Early construction at the Spade involved documented work by Mexican laborers, adobe buildings, stable construction. The work was noted in records. The details were sparse. The fact was recorded. Labor crossed ethnic lines because the work required hands more than it required specific backgrounds. But the story that persisted was about cowboys, the lone rider, the man on horseback, the figure on the horizon. That image sold the myth of ranching. It didn't capture the reality. The reality was hours, long hours, cold hours, wet hours, hours that didn't end when you wanted them to end, hours that started before dawn and extended past dark. 1893. A storm came across the South Plains. The moon disappeared behind clouds. The sky turned solid. Then the snow started. Not gentle snow, stinging snow. Snow that felt like sand blown by wind that had crossed hundreds of miles without obstacle. The cattle were in the north pasture. The pasture was large, too large to gather quickly. The storm hit before anyone could move them. The herd scattered. Animals drifted with the wind, looking for shelter that didn't exist. The foreman sent men out, not because it was safe, but because cattle left in a storm like that would die or disappear. The investment had to be protected. The men rode into conditions that made visibility impossible. Hours passed. The men stayed in their saddles, riding blind, listening for cattle, trying to turn animals back toward the center of the pasture, trying to keep them from drifting through fences they couldn't see. The work was dangerous, necessary, unpaid beyond the monthly wage that was already set. A wagon sheet became a windbreak. Someone improvised shelter. The men who couldn't keep riding stopped there. They waited. They were cold. They were wet. The snow kept falling. The wind kept blowing. Nothing to do but wait for it to pass. When daybreak came, someone boiled coffee. The fire was small. The heat barely reached past the flames. The coffee was weak but hot. That mattered more than the taste. The men drank it, then they went back to riding. The cattle had drifted miles. They were scattered. Some were lost, some were found days later, some were never found. The storm cost the ranch animals hours and labor that couldn't be recovered. The foreman's report noted the losses but didn't note the hours men spent riding through conditions that could have killed them, didn't note the exhaustion, the risk, the fact that men did work that exceeded what their monthly wage covered. That was the hidden cost, the labor that went beyond accounting, the hours that didn't appear in ledgers, the work that happened because not doing it meant losing everything the system was built to protect. The monthly wage paid for standard work. Storm work wasn't standard, but it was expected. Expected without negotiation, without additional compensation, because that was the job. You rode when the foreman said ride. You stayed out until the work was done or until you physically couldn't continue. The Spade employed dozens of men over its operational life. The exact number fluctuated, but the work didn't. Someone always needed to ride fence, maintain windmills, be ready when storms came. The system depended on that labor, took it for granted, counted costs in wire, windmill parts, railroad shipping fees, counted labor as a fixed monthly expense, but didn't count hours past exhaustion, hours in storms, hours that risked lives to protect property. Isaac Elwood was in Illinois during the 1893 storm. He received a report that summarized losses but didn't summarize the night men spent riding through snow with no visibility. Elwood couldn't see that labor. He saw numbers, cattle lost, revenue reduced, costs that needed to be offset. The gap between the work and the accounting was where the hidden costs lived. The costs weren't hidden because someone was lying. They were hidden because the system didn't have a way to measure them. How do you put a price on riding through a blizzard? How do you account for risk that didn't result in death but could have? You don't. You pay the monthly wage. You expect the work. You note the losses when they happen. You continue operating. Isaac Elwood died in 1910. He had owned the Spade for more than 2 decades. He had built it into an industrial-scale operation. He had proved barbed wire could turn open range into managed pasture. He had demonstrated that ranching could be engineered. His death created a question. His heirs inherited the ranch. They inherited the systems. They inherited the infrastructure. They inherited the land. But did they inherit the vision? Did they want to keep operating a ranch? Or did they want to convert the asset into something else? Keep the machine or liquidate it. Chapter 13, October 1924. The ranch didn't collapse. It converted. Isaac Elwood had died in 1910. His sons inherited the Spade. They inherited Renderbrook. They inherited the systems. They inherited the infrastructure. They inherited the question, what do you do with an industrial ranch when you didn't build it yourself? For over a decade, they kept operating. The fences held, the windmills pumped, the cattle grazed, the foreman managed. The ranch functioned as it had functioned under Isaac Elwood. The systems didn't require the founder to survive, but the calculation changed. The sons weren't wire manufacturers. They didn't see the ranch as a demonstration project for barbed wire. They saw it as land that had value, land that could generate revenue in different ways. William Leonard Elwood managed the ranch operations. He understood the systems. He'd learned them. But he also understood something else. The railroad had changed what land was worth. The land didn't have to remain pasture. It could become something else. In 1924, the decision was made. Liquidate. Not immediately, not recklessly, but deliberately, systematically. Turn the ranch into farms. Turn the investment into cash. Convert the asset. The pens jammed in October 1924. Not with the usual 3,000 to 5,000 head being shipped, 6,200 head. Cattle crowded into holding pens, waiting for rail cars. The volume exceeded normal capacity. The pens weren't built for this scale of shipment. The rail cars filled one after another, more cars than usual, more cattle per car than comfortable. The loading continued for days. This wasn't seasonal shipping. This was liquidation. This was converting cattle into cash as fast as the railroad could move them. 6,200 three-year-old steers shipped that October. The number represented more than a year's normal output. It represented a different strategy. Sell the cattle, then sell the land they grazed. The next spring, another major shipment, 5,200 head. The pattern was clear. Empty the range, stop breeding, stop maintaining breeding herds at Renderbrook, convert inventory to revenue. Make room for what came next. By 1926, approximately 80% of the northern division had been sold. Not to other ranchers, but to farmers, to people who would break the pastures into smaller units, who would plant crops where cattle had grazed, who would turn grazing land into farmland. The farmland posters appeared, advertisements, opportunities, good soil, railroad access, irrigation possible with windmills already in place. The infrastructure built for cattle could serve crops. The fences built for pastures could mark farm boundaries. The investment in wire and windmills transferred to new owners. Surveyors measured straight lines. The pastures that had averaged 40 sections each got divided into smaller parcels, 160 acres, 320 acres, sections, half sections, quarter sections. Sizes that individual farmers could manage, sizes that could be purchased with available capital or credit. The straight lines ignored the old pasture divisions. They followed the grid, township, range, section, the legal description of land. The surveyor's chains measured distances that became property boundaries. The boundaries became deed descriptions. The descriptions became sales. The conversion was methodical. This section sells. That section sells. The sections adjacent to railroad stops sold first. Prime farmland, easy transportation, maximum value. The sections farther from the railroad sold slower, still valuable, just less convenient. William Leonard Elwood managed the liquidation the same way his father had managed the ranch. Systematically. The goal had changed, the approach hadn't. Create a plan, execute the plan, document the results. Measure success by revenue generated. The cattle operation continued on reduced acreage. The ranch wasn't ending entirely, it was shrinking, contracting to a manageable size that could operate profitably with fewer resources. The industrial scale wasn't necessary anymore. The demonstration project had been completed. The market for barbed wire didn't need a 200,000-acre proof of concept. The Renderbrook operation stayed largely intact. The breeding ground remained. But the South Plains Spade corridor was being carved into farms. The long, narrow strip that had required line camps and constant patrol was being divided among dozens of owners who would each patrol their own much smaller sections. The conversion created opportunities for buyers, for the railroad, for towns that grew because more people meant more customers, for banks that financed the purchases, for surveyors who marked boundaries, for lawyers who handled deeds, for everyone except the people who had built the infrastructure. The cowboys who had ridden the fence line weren't needed for farms. The foremen who had managed pasture rotation weren't needed for crop rotation. The systems built for cattle didn't transfer to wheat. The knowledge accumulated in notebooks didn't apply to farming. The dynasty of foremen ended when the ranch ended. Some former Spade employees stayed, bought their own parcels, and became farmers. They turned knowledge of the land into a different kind of knowledge. Weather still mattered. Water still mattered. But the work was different. The rhythm was different. The calendar followed planting and harvest instead of calving and shipping. The liquidation was successful by the metrics that mattered to the Elwood heirs. The land sold. The prices were reasonable. The revenue returned capital that had been tied up in grass and cattle for decades. The family's investment in the Texas Panhandle converted into cash that could be invested elsewhere. The ranch, as Isaac Ellwood had built it, ceased to exist. The ranch as an idea persisted. The Spade brand was still registered. Cattle still carried the mark. But the scale had changed. The ambition had changed. The purpose had changed. What had been an industrial demonstration became a conventional operation. The numbers told the story. 6,200 head, 5,200 head, 80% liquidated, hundreds of individual sales, thousands of acres changing owners, millions of dollars in transactions. The story wasn't about collapse. It was about conversion, transformation, and an asset being repositioned for a different era. The buyers arrive. Chapter 14. The Fence Line. A fence line can become a property line without moving an inch. The wire was already there, a 6-wire perimeter, 5-wire cross fences, miles of it, stretched tight and stapled to posts. The wire had marked pasture boundaries. Now it marked farm boundaries. The wire didn't move, but the meaning changed. A farmhouse rose on land that had been open range. A wood frame, simple construction. The kind of house a family could build with available materials and limited capital. The house sat where cattle had grazed, where a line camp might have been, where nothing permanent had stood before. More farmhouses appeared, not all at once, over months, over years. Each farmhouse represented a sale, a parcel purchased, a family committed to making the land productive in a different way. The houses were modest, functional, built for work, not display. The old wire boundaries became property lines. The fence that had kept cattle in one pasture now kept one farmer's crop separate from the neighbor's. The function changed, but the fence remained. The posts were the same. The wire was the same. The staples held. Property deeds referenced the fences, and legal descriptions mentioned them. The north boundary follows the existing fence line. The east boundary follows the existing fence line. The infrastructure built for cattle became the infrastructure for farms, and the investment transferred. Towns appeared where the railroad had put stations, where surveyors had drawn plats, where investors had seen opportunity. The towns weren't random. They were planned, deliberately positioned to serve the farms replacing the ranch. A town name appeared on a painted wood sign with simple letters. The sign marked a crossroads that became a main street, which collected buildings, a general store, a grain elevator, a post office, a church, the structures that made a settlement into a town. Some towns used new names, chosen by developers or railroad companies, names that sounded promising, that suggested opportunity. The names went on maps, on letterheads, on documents filed with the county. One community kept a connection to what had been there before: Spade. The name persisted. The community formed near where the earlier ranch headquarters had been, a fixed point in the corridor. The town of Spade became a fixed point in the farm country. The Spade community wasn't large. It didn't become a major town, but it existed. The name on the sign connected the present to the past. The Spade brand had marked cattle. Now it marked a place, outliving the ranch that created it. The towns grew because farms needed services, supplies, markets for crops, access to credit, repairs, social connections. The towns provided these things. The towns existed because the farms existed, and the farms existed because the ranch had been liquidated. The transformation was visible. Drive across the South Plains and you could see it. Farmhouses where grass had been, plowed fields where cattle had grazed, town buildings where nothing had stood. Roads connected farms to towns, towns connected to railroads, railroads moving crops instead of cattle. The fence lines helped make sense of it. They showed where boundaries had been and where they are now, providing continuity even as everything else changed. The wire hadn't moved, the land around it had been transformed. The old pasture system was gone. The 40-section pastures had been divided, subdivided, sold in parcels that individual families could manage. The corridor no longer existed as a continuous entity. It existed as dozens of separate properties, separate owners, separate operations. But the pattern was still visible. The railroad cutting through, the towns positioned along it, the farms arranged in sections, the whole landscape organized according to the grid, township and range, section lines, quarter sections. The geometry that had started with surveying stakes had become the physical reality. The conversion from ranch to farmland was complete in some areas, still happening in others. The process took years, but the direction was clear. The South Plains Spade as it had existed was becoming something else. The land was being repurposed. The investment was being redistributed. The concentrated ownership was being replaced by dispersed ownership. The people who bought the land came with different knowledge. They knew farming, or they learned it. They did not know ranching, and they did not need to. The infrastructure built for cattle worked well enough for crops. The windmills pumped water for irrigation. The fences marked boundaries. The railroad shipped wheat instead of steers. The transformation was economic as much as physical. Capital that had been tied up in a single large operation was now distributed across many smaller operations. Risk that had been concentrated was now spread. The land that had generated revenue through cattle now generated revenue through crops. The fundamental logic had changed. Numbers and loans make it legible. Chapter 15. 914. The new owners didn't ride in, they signed in. The transaction happened on paper. Loan papers, purchase agreements, deed transfers, title documents. The land changed hands through signatures, through financial instruments, through legal processes that didn't require anyone to see the actual ground. The loan papers came from banks, local banks, regional banks, federal institutions. The papers had blank spaces for names, for acreage amounts, for purchase prices, for payment terms. The blanks got filled in. One transaction at a time, bank letterheads varied. Some were plain, some were ornate. All served the same function, official documentation, proof that credit had been extended, proof that someone had agreed to lend money for someone else to buy land. The letterheads represented institutional backing for individual ambition. The Federal Land Bank was especially active. The bank had been created to finance agricultural development, to make capital available for farmers, to enable land purchases that wouldn't have been possible with cash alone. Nearly half the purchasers used Federal Land Bank loans. The institution facilitated the conversion, made it financially possible, turned pasture into farms through credit. Surveyor chains measured what had already been measured. The sections had been surveyed decades earlier, but now they needed to be divided, subdivided. The chains marked boundaries within sections, half sections, quarter sections, parcels that fit the financial capacity of individual buyers. The chains turned abstract legal descriptions into physical markers, stakes in the ground, wire between the stakes, property lines that someone could walk. The rehabilitation project map showed the big picture: where land had been sold, where it remained unsold, which parcels went to which buyers. The map was administrative, a tool for tracking the liquidation, a visual representation of conversion in progress. The map changed as sales closed, more parcels shaded as sold, fewer parcels remaining. By 1938, 189,000 acres had been sold. The number represented most of the South Plains Spade. The corridor ranch had been dismantled, piece by piece, section by section. The sales had taken over a decade, but the outcome was clear. The ranch, as Isaac Elwood built it, no longer existed. 914 purchasers. That number mattered. 914 separate transactions, 914 families or individuals or small partnerships. The concentrated ownership had been replaced by dispersed ownership. The single entity had become hundreds of entities, each with its own deed, its own loan, its own patch of what had been continuous pasture. 84% of the purchasers were Texans, local buyers, regional buyers, people from the state. Not outsiders arriving from distant places, not speculators from Chicago or New York. People who knew the area, who understood the land, who planned to farm it themselves, or saw it as investment in familiar territory. The Texas Panhandle was being settled by Texans. The financing patterns told a story. Nearly half used federal land bank loans, government-backed credit making private land ownership possible. The relationship between public institutions and private agriculture, between federal policy and individual opportunity. The land was being colonized through a partnership between buyers who wanted farms and a government that wanted those farms to exist. The buyers weren't wealthy. They were using credit because they didn't have enough cash to buy land outright. The credit terms were manageable. Long payment periods, reasonable interest rates, terms designed to enable purchase rather than prevent it. The Federal Land Bank wasn't trying to maximize profit. It was trying to maximize the number of successful farm operations. By 1947, the Elwood family retained 21,754 acres. That was what remained, from 262,000 acres at peak to 21,754. The ranch had shrunk by 90%. The empire had contracted to a manageable operation, still substantial but no longer industrial scale, no longer requiring line camps and corridors and systematic patrol. The retained acreage still operated as a ranch, still ran cattle, still used the Spade brand. But the purpose had changed. This wasn't a demonstration project anymore. This wasn't market-making. This was conventional ranching, an operation sized to generate profit without requiring constant reinvestment in infrastructure, an operation that could function without the systems that had defined the corridor ranch. The numbers added up to transformation. 189,000 acres sold means 189,000 acres no longer grazed by Spade cattle. 914 purchasers means 914 new agricultural operations. 84% Texans means local integration rather than outside colonization. Nearly half with federal land bank loans means government policy enabling private ownership. 21,754 acres retained means the Spade brand survived even as the empire dissolved. The colonization was methodical, not chaotic, not rushed, deliberate. The Elwood family managed the liquidation as carefully as Isaac Elwood had managed the ranch. Find buyers, verify financing, transfer title, document the transaction, Move to the next parcel. The process repeated 914 times. Each transaction was small in isolation, a section here, a quarter section there. But accumulated, they represented the largest land redistribution in the history of the Texas Panhandle. An industrial ranch converted to hundreds of family farms. Concentrated ownership replaced by dispersed ownership. A demonstration of what barbed wire could do, replaced by a demonstration of what credit could do. The buyers were optimistic. They had to be. Buying land with borrowed money required believing the land would produce enough to repay the loan and support a family. The optimism was justified in some cases, not in others. Farming on the South Plains was risky: drought years, dust bowl conditions, market collapses. But the buyers signed anyway. They signed because opportunity looked real, because land ownership meant something, because building a farm on former ranch land felt like progress. Land sells, brands travel. Chapter 16. 13 employees. The empire shrank, but the spade stayed sharp. The blacksmith shop was moved to a museum, but only the portable parts, an anvil, tools, and forge equipment were taken. Those items represented ranch work from an earlier era. The museum displayed them alongside other artifacts. The past was preserved, while the present moved on. But the ranch still operated, smaller and different, still carrying the Spade brand. The brand had started in Lamar County and had marked 262,000 acres at its peak. It remained registered and applied to cattle. The mark survived even as the empire dissolved. The modern Spade employed 13 salaried workers, 13 people, not the dozens once needed to patrol 54 miles of corridor. These 13 people managed operations that no longer required line camps or constant fence patrol across continuous pasture, operating only what remained. Each ranch retained about 2 full-time cowboys, 2 per ranch, enough to handle daily work, move cattle, and maintain infrastructure on a manageable scale. It was not enough to recreate what Norfleet had built or to operate an industrial system, but sufficient to run a conventional ranch. The work had changed. Cowboys still rode, but not to patrol endless fence lines or check windmills spaced 4 miles apart across a corridor. The scale had shrunk, and the work became manageable. The romance of isolation was replaced by routine. Paperwork sat on a truck hood, modern lease agreements, stocking rates, and government forms. It was the same kind of paperwork any ranch dealt with, nothing industrial or systematic beyond what conventional operations required. Someone reviewed the papers, signed where needed, filed them, and moved to the next task. Calves still got tagged. The process was the same: catch the calf, apply the ear tag, record the number, and release the animal. The Spade brand was still applied with hot iron, the old method that connected present operations to historical ones, marking each calf as a Spade calf. The windmill check felt like it was still 1902. Climb the tower, check the mechanism, apply grease, test the pump, climb down, and ride to the next windmill. The technology hadn't changed much, though the frequency had. Fewer windmills meant fewer checks, but the work remained the same as cowboys had done a century earlier. The ranches had diversified. Hunting leases generated revenue, about $8 per acre. Land once engineered for cattle now served hunters for deer and quail, wildlife that had always existed. The difference was that someone now paid for access, turning grassland from pasture value to habitat value. The hunting revenue mattered. It supplemented cattle revenue, making the operation more stable and less dependent on single commodity prices. The diversification was practical, not ideological, just economics. Use the land for what it could produce: cattle, game, whatever generated return. In January 2009, the Spade Ranches began leasing additional land. The Alpine lease of 27,000 acres in far west Texas, with room for approximately 400 cows. The lease expanded operations without requiring purchase, demonstrating that the brand could travel and that Spade cattle could graze land hundreds of miles from the original corridor. The Alpine lease was strategic, providing access to different grass, markets, and geographic diversification for risk management. The thinking was industrial, even if the scale wasn't. The approach was calculated and systematic, applying the same logic that built the corridor ranch to modern conditions. The retained 21,754 acres continued to operate, profitable some years and not in others. Variability was normal, ranching was variable, and weather changed. Markets changed, costs changed. You operated through the cycles. You survived or you did not. The Spade survived. Smaller, more conventional, but continuous. The same legal entity, the same brand, the same basic business, converting grass to beef, selling beef to market. The fundamentals had not changed. The scale had. The modern operation bore little resemblance to what Isaac Ellwood had built. The corridor was gone. The two-ranch supply chain was gone. The industrial systems were gone. What remained was conventional, a ranch among ranches, notable mostly for the brand it carried, for the history behind the name. But the history raised questions. Questions that didn't have definitive answers, questions about what the Spade had really been, about what it meant to build it, about whether the meaning changed when it got liquidated. Some see an industrial strategy. Elwood owned a wire factory. He bought land that needed fencing. The ranch demonstrated wire by using wire. The demonstration created demand. Demand sold wire. Others see a ranch that created value. The cattle were real. The systems worked. The land produced. Hundreds of families bought farms because the ranch succeeded. The success preceded the liquidation. The liquidation supports both views. An asset must be created before it can be sold. But was it built to be an asset? Or did it become one? The liquidation could support either interpretation. Selling the ranch proved it was an asset, but assets get created before they get sold. The question wasn't whether the Spade became valuable. The question was whether it had been built to become valuable, whether the cattle were ever the point, whether the grass mattered except as a way to demonstrate that wire mattered. The modern operation offered no answers, just continuity. The brand still applied. The cattle still grazed, the land still produced, the Spade still existed. Smaller, quieter, less ambitious, but present. The windmills still turned, the fences still stood. Some of the wire was original wire, wire installed in the 1880s, wire that had lasted more than a century, wire that would outlast the cattle, outlast the cowboys. Maybe outlast the brand itself. Frontier dream or wire machine, ranch or strategy. The answer depends on which numbers you believe. The Spade stayed sharp. The meaning stayed uncertain.